The morning sun peeked through the curtains of Harold Thompson's modest home, casting warm shadows across his weathered face. At 93 years old, the World War II veteran moved a bit slower these days, but his daily routine never changed. His wrinkled hands, marked with age spots and old scars, carefully made his bed with military precision, a habit he couldn't shake even after 75 years. Harold lived alone in his small white house on Cedar Street, at the edge of Pine Grove, Montana. The neighborhood had changed a lot since he and his late wife, Martha, bought the place in 1955. Most of the old neighbors were gone now, replaced by younger families who barely had time to wave hello. But Harold didn't mind. He found peace in his quiet life and simple routines. Every morning at exactly 7 o'clock a.m., Harold put on his favorite blue cardigan and his trusted brown leather shoes. The shoes were old and worn, but Harold believed in taking care of things until they couldn't be fixed anymore. That's how his generation thought. Nothing went to waste, and everything had value. The highlight of Harold's morning was raising the American flag outside his house. He kept it folded in a perfect triangle, just like he learned in the Marines. With careful movements, he would attach it to the flagpole and watch it catch the morning breeze. Sometimes his hand shook a little, but he never dropped it. Not once in all these years. After the flag ceremony, Harold walked to Mary's Diner 3 blocks away. The walk took him 20 minutes now, instead of the 10 it used to take, but he refused to use a cane. A Marine adapts and overcomes, he would say with a small smile whenever anyone suggested he should use one. At the diner, Harold sat at the same corner booth every day. The red vinyl seats were cracked, and the table had scratches from decades of use, but it felt like home. Mary, the owner's daughter, named after her mother who started the place, always had his coffee ready, black, no sugar, with 2 strips of bacon and 1 egg over it easy. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Mary would say, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners. She was in her 50s now, but Harold still remembered when she was a little girl running around the diner in pigtails. "The usual?" Harold would nod and smile, pulling out his worn leather wallet to count out exact change. He never let them give him free meals, even though Mary often tried. "A man pays his way," he'd say firmly but kindly. While eating his breakfast, Harold liked to look at the old photographs on the diner's walls. Many of them showed Pine Grove from the 1940s and 50s, when he first came home from the war. His favorite was a faded picture of Main Street from 1946, the year he met Martha at the town's Victory Day parade. He was in his uniform, she was wearing a blue polka dot dress, and the whole town was celebrating peace. After breakfast, Harold spent most mornings in his garden. It wasn't very big, but he grew tomatoes, peppers, and Martha's favorite roses. The roses were special. They were the same kind he gave her on their first date. Even now, years after she passed away, he took care of them like they were precious gold. The neighborhood kids sometimes stopped to watch him garden. Harold would tell them stories about the vegetables he grew, teaching them how to tell when a tomato was perfectly ripe. He never talked about the war, though. Those memories stayed locked away, like the box of medals in his bedroom drawer, a Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and others he earned in battles he preferred to forget. In the afternoons, Harold sat on his porch in an old rocking chair, watching the world go by. He kept his Marine Corps cap on the small table beside him, its gold emblem still shining after all these years. Sometimes, passing veterans would notice it and stop to salute. Harold always stood up to return their salute, no matter how much his joints protested. As evening approached, Harold would take down the flag with the same care he used to raise it. His neighbors could set their watches by this ritual. Every day at sunset, Harold Thompson would be out there, carefully folding the flag into a perfect triangle, his movements slow but precise. This was Harold's life, simple, quiet, and dignified. He didn't need much to be happy. His small house, his garden, his flag, and his memories were enough. Little did he know that his peaceful routine was about to be disrupted in ways he could never have imagined. It was a peaceful spring afternoon when Harold first heard the thunderous roar of motorcycles. At first, he thought they were just passing through Cedar Street, like many riders did during the warm months. But this time was different. The noise didn't fade away, instead, it got louder. 5 motorcycles pulled into the empty lot next to Harold's property. The lot used to belong to the Andersons before their house burned down 2 years ago, and since then it had stayed empty, collecting weeds and old newspapers. The bikers cut their engines, and the sudden silence felt strange after all that noise. Harold watched from his porch as the riders dismounted their bikes. They were nothing like the friendly veteran riders who sometimes stopped to salute him. These men wore dirty leather vests with a snarling wolf patch on the back, the mark of the Steel Wolves, a motorcycle gang known for causing trouble in nearby towns. The biggest of the bikers, a man with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos, cracked open a beer and tossed the can into Harold's yard. His friends laughed, and soon they were all drinking, playing loud music from a portable speaker, and making themselves at home in the empty lot. Mrs. Rodriguez, Harold's neighbor from across the street, hurried inside her house when she saw them. She had her young grandchildren over often, and these weren't the kind of people she wanted them to see. Other neighbors peeked through their curtains, but nobody said anything. The next day, more bikers showed up. They brought old couches and chairs, turning the empty lot into their personal hangout. Empty cans and food wrappers started piling up, some blowing into Harold's carefully tended garden. The air filled with cigarette smoke and the smell of marijuana, making it hard for Harold to sit on his porch like he used to. When Harold politely asked them to clean up their trash, the bearded leader, who called himself Razor, just laughed. "What are you gonna do about it, old man?" he sneered, while his friends snickered behind him. Harold noticed the leader had a faded military tattoo on his arm, but it wasn't one earned through service, it was just for show. The gang started showing up every day, usually around noon, when the sun was highest and Harold would normally be tending to his garden. Their bikes were so loud that the windows of his house rattled. Sometimes they revved their engines just to see him jump at the sudden noise. Harold tried calling the police, but Officer Jenkins could only do so much. "Unless they break a law while we're here, our hands are tied," he explained apologetically. "The lot is private property, and the owner lives in California now. He doesn't care who uses it." The neighbors started avoiding that side of the street entirely. Parents wouldn't let their children play outside anymore, and the peaceful atmosphere of Cedar Street disappeared. Even Mary from the diner noticed the change in Harold when he came for his morning coffee. "You look tired, Mr. Thompson," she said one morning, worried about the dark circles under his eyes. "The bikers' late-night parties have been keeping him awake." "Just not sleeping well lately," Harold replied with a weak smile, not wanting to worry her. But Mary had heard about the Steel Wolves from other customers. She knew they were bad news. One afternoon, Harold was trying to read his newspaper on the porch when Razor walked up to his fence. "Nice house you got here, Gramps," he said, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. "Shame if something happened to it." Two other bikers stood behind him, grinning like they just heard a great joke. Harold's hands gripped his newspaper tighter, but his face stayed calm. He faced worse threats in the Pacific during the war. Still, he couldn't deny that the situation was getting serious. The Steel Wolves weren't just noisy neighbors anymore, they were turning into real trouble. That night, as Harold carefully folded his flag at sunset, he watched the bikers setting up for another party. They dragged more furniture into the lot and strung up lights, like they were planning to stay forever. Music already blasted from their speakers, and more gang members were arriving on their motorcycles. Looking at his peaceful home, now shadowed by this growing threat, Harold realized that something had to change. He couldn't let these bullies take over the neighborhood he and Martha had called home for over 60 years. But at 93, what could he do against a gang of violent bikers? The answer would come to him soon enough, though not in a way anyone could have expected. The situation with the Steel Wolves grew worse with each passing day. What started as noise and littering turned into something much darker. The gang seemed to take special pleasure in tormenting Harold, turning their attention away from general troublemaking to focus on making the old veteran's life miserable. It began with small things. Every morning, Harold would find his newspaper in the mud instead of on his porch where the paperboy always carefully placed it. His mailbox was knocked crooked one day, then completely off its post the next. Empty beer cans and cigarette butts mysteriously appeared in his garden beds, crushing his beloved tomato plants. The gang's leader, Razor, had figured out that Harold was a creature of habit. They started timing their loudest activities to coincide with his daily routines. When Harold would step out to tend his garden at 10 a.m., suddenly 5 or 6 motorcycles would roar to life. When he tried shifting his schedule, they adjusted theirs to match. Mrs. Rodriguez watched from her window as Harold struggled to rake leaves one afternoon, his old hands shaking as the bikers circled their motorcycles around the edge of his property, kicking up dust and scattering the neat piles he had made. She wanted to help, but her daughter had made her promise to stay away after one of the bikers had threatened to visit at night if anyone complained. Even Mary's diner wasn't safe anymore. Some of the steel wolves started showing up there in the mornings, sitting near Harold's usual booth and making crude jokes about World War II veterans. "Hey, Gramps," one would call out, "did you forget your walker today?" Another would add, "Better hurry up and eat before you forget how." Their rough laughter would fill the diner, making other customers uncomfortable. Harold tried to ignore them, focusing on his coffee and eggs, but their words stung. He had fought in some of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific, watched good friends die, and earned medals he kept tucked away in his drawer. These young troublemakers had no idea what real courage and sacrifice meant. Officer Jenkins made more frequent patrols down Cedar Street, but it didn't help much. The moment his police car disappeared around the corner, the harassment would start again. The bikers were clever enough to stay just within the law, or at least to make sure there were no witnesses when they crossed the line. One rainy Tuesday, Harold discovered someone had spray-painted "Old Fool" across his garage door during the night. The harsh black letters stood out against the white paint like an ugly scar. It took him 3 hours in the drizzling rain to scrub it off, his shoulders aching, while the bikers watched and laughed from their lot. That same week, Harold's garden took the worst hit yet. He woke up to find his rose bushes, Martha's roses that he had tenderly cared for all these years, had been deliberately trampled. Tire tracks in the soft earth showed where a motorcycle had driven right through his garden bed. The roses were crushed, their stems broken, pink petals scattered across the mud. For the first time since Martha passed away, Harold felt tears in his eyes. He knelt in the dirt, trying to save what he could of the roses, but most were damaged beyond repair. Through his window, you could see Razor watching him, a satisfied smirk on his face as he sipped his morning beer. The neighbors had started a petition to get the city council involved, but bureaucracy moved slowly. Harold received sympathetic looks and quiet words of support when he went to the grocery store or post office, but no one dared to do more. The Steel Wolves had a reputation for revenge, and people had families to protect. That evening, as Harold sat alone in his living room, he looked at the old photographs on his wall. There he was in his Marine dress uniform, standing proud with his unit. Another showed him and Martha on their wedding day, both so young and full of hope. A third captured him receiving his Bronze Star, a moment of honor from a time when right and wrong seemed clearer. His hands, though shakier now, could still feel the weight of his rifle from those days in the Pacific. His mind, while not as quick as it used to be, still held the sharp memories of battles won through strategy and brotherhood rather than brute force. The Steel Wolves thought they were dealing with a helpless old man, but they had forgotten something important. Once a Marine, always a Marine. As Harold watched through his window, seeing the bikers set up for another night of chaos, something inside him hardened. He had defended freedom on foreign shores. He wasn't about to surrender it in his own front yard. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, he would show these bullies that they had picked the wrong veteran to torment. Memorial Day dawned clear and bright in Pine Grove. Harold woke up earlier than usual, his old bones aching a bit more than normal. This day had always been special to him, a day to remember fallen brothers, to honor sacrifices made on distant shores. He put on his best shirt, the blue one Martha had given him on their last anniversary together, and pinned his Marine Corps badge carefully to his collar. The town usually held a small ceremony in the park, and Harold hadn't missed one in 60 years. He took extra care raising the flag that morning, focusing on each fold and movement as he raised it to full staff, then lowered it to half staff as tradition required for Memorial Day until noon. But something felt wrong. The street was too quiet. Usually, by this time, Mrs. Rodriguez would be outside, putting up her own flag. Even the troublemakers in the empty lot seemed unusually silent. That's when Harold heard the muffled laughter coming from behind his house. His heart beating faster, Harold walked around the corner of his home. The sight that met his eyes stopped him cold. His American flag, the one he had raised and lowered every day for decades, lay crumpled in the dirt. The flagpole was bent at an awkward angle, clearly damaged on purpose. Razor and 3 other Steel Wolves stood nearby, watching for his reaction. They had empty beer cans in their hands, despite the early hour. One of them was recording everything on his phone, probably hoping to capture the old man's distress for their amusement. Oops, Razor said with fake innocence, crushing another beer can and tossing it onto the fallen flag. Looks like your stick fell down, old-timer. Wind must have been too strong. The others laughed, but their eyes watched Harold carefully, hoping to provoke a reaction they could use against him. Harold stood very still. In his mind, he was suddenly back in Okinawa, watching a young Marine raise their flag after a brutal battle. He remembered the pride, the cost, the sacrifice. Every morning since returning home, raising and lowering the flag had been his way of honoring those who never made it back. His hands trembled, but not from fear. The rage he felt was cold and sharp, like the morning air before a battle. He had survived Japanese artillery, jungle warfare, and the loss of dear friends. He had held dying Marines in his arms and promised to live a life worthy of their sacrifice. And now these thugs thought they could disrespect everything that flag stood for. Slowly, carefully, Harold bent down to pick up the flag. His joints protested, but he refused to show weakness. With deliberate movements, he brushed off the dirt and began to fold it properly, ignoring the jeers and mock salutes from the bikers. "Oh, look at him," one of the younger gang members taunted, treating a piece of cloth like it's something special. He moved as if to kick more dirt onto the flag, but Razor held him back, wanting to see what the old man would do next. Harold finished folding the flag into a perfect triangle, just as he had done thousands of times before. He held it close to his chest and turned to face the bikers. His blue eyes, usually warm and gentle, had turned hard as steel. The gang members shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. It wasn't the look of a frightened old man, but the steady stare of a Marine who had seen real combat. Without a word, Harold walked back into his house. The bikers laughed nervously, unsure what to make of his silence. Through his window, they could see him place the folded flag carefully on his coffee table. Then he did something they didn't expect. He walked to his old rotary phone. "Look at that," Razor called out to his gang. "The old man's calling the cops again. Real scary." But his voice held a note of uncertainty. Something about Harold's calm demeanor had changed. This wasn't like the other times they had harassed him. Inside his house, Harold's wrinkled fingers moved with purpose as he dialed a number he hadn't called in many years. His voice, when he spoke into the receiver, was clear and strong. He wasn't calling the local police this time. No, this call would reach much further, and its consequences would be far more significant than the Steel Wolves could possibly imagine. Harold's fingers hadn't dialed this particular number since 1995, when his old Marine unit held their 50th reunion, but he remembered it perfectly. The phone rang 3 times before a young woman's voice answered. "United States Marine Corps, 5th Division Association Office. This is Sergeant Harold Thompson, 5th Marine Division, 27th Regiment, World War II, Harold said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Service number 872 to 549. Even after all these years, the numbers rolled off his tongue like he'd never forgotten them. The woman on the other end grew quiet for a moment. "One moment, please, sir," she said, her tone changing to one of deep respect. Harold could hear typing in the background as she looked up his records. Outside, the Steel Wolves were still laughing, thinking he was making another useless call to the local police. Razor had pulled out his phone, recording video of himself pretending to be a frightened old man calling for help. But Harold wasn't paying attention to them anymore. "Sergeant Thompson," a new voice came on the line, this one belonging to a Marine colonel. "I'm looking at your service records, sir. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Bronze Star, Purple Heart." The colonel paused. "What can the courts do for you today, Sergeant?" Harold told his story simply, without self-pity or exaggeration. He described the Steel Wolves' harassment, the vandalism, and finally, the desecration of his flag on Memorial Day. As he spoke, he could hear more people gathering around the colonel's phone, listening. "Send us some pictures of what they've done, Sergeant," the colonel said firmly. "And give us 24 hours. Another voice in the background added, "Make that 12 hours, sir." Mrs. Rodriguez, watching from her window, saw Harold take a few photos with the small digital camera his granddaughter had given him last Christmas. He had never quite gotten the hang of it, but today his hands were steady as he documented the damage. Within an hour of Harold sending the pictures, something extraordinary started happening. The images began spreading across veteran social media groups and military forums. The story of a 93-year-old World War II Marine being harassed by bikers caught fire online. Marine veterans dug deeper into Harold's service record, and what they found amazed them. During the Battle of Okinawa, Harold had saved 3 wounded Marines while under heavy fire. His Bronze Star citation told of his bravery under impossible odds. The story spread further, reaching active duty Marines, other service branches, and veteran motorcycle clubs across the country. By late afternoon, Harold's phone started ringing. First, it was the president of the local Vietnam Veterans Association. Then came calls from the American Legion, the VFW, and dozens of veteran motorcycle clubs. Each caller had the same message. "We're coming, Sergeant. Hold your position." The Steel Wolves noticed Harold's phone ringing throughout the day but thought nothing of it. They were too busy celebrating their victory over the old man, planning how to make his life even more miserable tomorrow. As evening approached, Harold received one final call. It was from a Marine Master Sergeant at the local recruiting office, 50 miles away. Sergeant Thompson, the young Marine, said, "We got your 6. Sunrise tomorrow. Semper Fi." Harold smiled at the familiar motto, always faithful. That night, Harold slept better than he had in weeks. His damaged flag lay carefully folded on his coffee table, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Tomorrow, it would fly again. In towns and cities across the state, motorcycles were being prepped, chains cleaned, and leather vests pulled out of closets. But these weren't the vests of criminal gangs. These bore the patches of men and women who had served their country with honor. The American Legion Riders, the Patriot Guard, Marine Corps Veterans Association, and countless other veteran motorcycle groups were planning early morning rides. Social media buzzed with activity as riders coordinated their routes. Google Maps showed an unusual number of motorcycles heading toward Pine Grove. News stations began picking up the story. World War II Marine veterans standing his ground. The Steel Wolves, celebrating their perceived victory in their makeshift camp, had no idea what was coming. They thought they had broken an old man's spirit. Instead, they had awakened a brotherhood that stretched back generations, one that lived by a code they couldn't understand: never leave a Marine behind. As Harold prepared for bed that night, he looked at the old photo of his Marine unit on the wall. "We've got reinforcements coming, boys," he whispered to the faces of his long-ago brothers. Tomorrow would bring a response that Razor and his gang never saw coming. The sun hadn't yet risen when Harold heard the first distant rumble. It started as a low thunder far away, growing steadily louder as dawn broke over Pine Grove. He was already awake, dressed in his pressed khakis and his old Marine Corps jacket that still fit perfectly after all these years. At exactly 6 a.m., the first motorcycles appeared at the end of Cedar Street. They rode in perfect formation, 2 by 2, their headlights cutting through the morning mist. The lead bike carried an American flag, and behind it came the Marine Corps flag, snapping proudly in the wind. Harold stepped onto his porch, standing straight despite his age. The lead rider, a tall man with silver hair wearing the Marine Corps veteran vest, pulled up in front of Harold's house. Behind him, more motorcycles kept coming. They filled the street in both directions. Harley-Davidsons, Indians, and other bikes, all gleaming in the early morning light. The riders weren't young men like the Steel Wolves. These were veterans of Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Some were older than Harold, some young enough to be his grandchildren, but all carried themselves with the same quiet discipline that marked them as military. The lead rider dismounted and walked up to Harold's porch. He snapped to attention and saluted. "Master Sergeant James Cooper, USMC retired, sir," he said formally. "The cavalry has arrived, Sergeant Thompson." Harold returned the salute, his old eyes growing misty. More than 50 motorcycles had arrived now, their riders dismounting and forming a line along his property. Each wore a different vest: Marine Corps veterans, American Legion riders, VFW Motorcycle Club, Patriot Guard riders, but they moved as one unit. Mrs. Rodriguez came out of her house, tears in her eyes as she watched the scene unfold. Other neighbors appeared on their porches, drawn by the sound of so many motorcycles. Children pointed excitedly at the flags and the gleaming bikes. A group of active duty Marines from the recruiting office arrived next, their dress blues perfect in the morning light. They carried a new flagpole and a fresh American flag. Without a word, they began installing it where the old one had stood, their movements precise and respectful. The steel wolves, who usually slept late after their nights of drinking, were awakened by the noise. Razor and his gang stumbled out of their tents in the empty lot, bleary-eyed and confused. The sight that met them was unlike anything they had expected. The street was now filled with over 100 motorcycles. Their riders stood in formation, creating a wall of leather vests decorated with combat medals, unit patches, and American flags. These weren't weekend warriors playing at being tough. These were men and women who had proven their courage in real battles. A younger veteran stepped forward, his prosthetic leg visible below his shorts. "We brought breakfast, Sergeant Thompson," he said, holding up bags from Mary's diner. Mary herself had opened early just for this, and she'd made Harold's usual order: black coffee, 2 strips of bacon, and 1 egg over easy. The veterans set up tables on Harold's lawn, creating an impromptu gathering. They shared coffee and stories, but their eyes never left the Steel Wolves' camp. The message was clear: this ground was now protected. As the morning went on, more riders arrived. A group of Navy veterans rode in from the coast. Army motorcycle clubs came from 3 different states. Even a few Air Force riders joined the gathering. Each new arrival stopped to salute Harold and shake his hand. Local TV news crews began showing up, drawn by the unusual sight. Reporters interviewed Harold, who spoke humbly about his service and his love for his country. The veterans around him beamed with pride as he described the Battle of Okinawa, where he earned his Bronze Star. When the new flagpole was ready, the active duty Marines asked Harold to do the honors. His hands were steady as he raised the fresh flag, the morning sun catching it perfectly as it unfurled in the breeze. 100 veterans snapped to attention and saluted. The Steel Wolves watched from their lot, their usual bravado completely gone. They had spent weeks tormenting a man they thought was alone and defenseless. Now they realized how wrong they had been. Harold Thompson was never alone. He was part of a brotherhood that spanned generations, one that would always answer the call when one of their own needed help. By mid-morning, the temperature was rising, but none of the veteran riders showed any sign of leaving. They had settled into a protective formation around Harold's property, their bikes parked in neat rows along Cedar Street. The Steel Wolves remained huddled in their lot, clearly unsure what to do next. Master Sergeant Cooper gathered a small group of veteran riders, including 2 retired police officers and a former JG court lawyer. Together, they walked toward the Steel Wolves' camp. Their steps were measured and calm, but their faces showed the kind of determination that comes from years of real combat experience. Razor tried to put on a brave face as they approached, but his usual swagger was gone. His gang members shifted nervously behind him, some already edging toward their motorcycles. The difference between these veterans and the Steel Wolves was stark. Where the gang wore artificial toughness like a costume, these men and women carried real strength earned through sacrifice and service. "Let's talk," Cooper said firmly, his voice carrying the natural authority of a senior NCO. He held up a thick folder. "We documented everything you've done here. The property damage, the harassment, the flag desecration, all of it." One of the retired police officers stepped forward. "We got video evidence from neighbors' security cameras, witness statements, photos of the damage. Everything's been shared with local law enforcement and the FBI's gang task force." The former GAG lawyer added, "Destroying a veteran's property and desecrating the American flag, those are serious charges. And harassing a veteran over the age of 65? That's a federal hate crime with enhanced penalties." Razor's face had gone pale. He looked around at his gang members, but found no support. These weren't scared neighbors they could intimidate anymore. These were combat veterans who had faced far worse than a group of playground bullies. "We got 2 options here," Cooper continued, his voice level but stern. "Option 1, you pack up and leave. Never come back to Cedar Street or anywhere near Sergeant Thompson. We'll turn our evidence over to the authorities, and they can decide what to do with it." He paused, letting that sink in before adding, "Option 2, you stay, and we make sure every law enforcement agency in the state knows about your activities. Your names, your faces, your bikes. Everything goes into the system. And we'll be here, watching and documenting everything you do." From his porch, Harold watched the confrontation unfold. Mrs. Rodriguez stood beside him now, no longer afraid. Other neighbors had come out too, sensing that the balance of power had shifted dramatically. A young Steel Wolves member suddenly pushed past Razor. "This is garbage," he shouted, trying to sound tough. "You can't just come here and—" His words cut off as an enormous veteran stepped forward. The man's vest identified him as a former Force Recon Marine, his chest covered in combat decorations. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The young biker backed away quickly. Razor looked at his crumbling kingdom, the trash-strewn lot, the old couches, the empty beer cans. Then he looked at the wall of veterans facing him, their faces showing not anger, but the kind of quiet confidence that comes from having faced real challenges in life. "We'll leave," Razor muttered, trying to save what little face he could. "But this ain't right, bringing all these people here to—" "No. What ain't right is bullying a 93-year-old Marine who fought for this country while you were nothing but a dream," Cooper interrupted. "What ain't right is disrespecting the flag that better men died protecting. You don't understand what right is, Stun." The Steel Wolves began packing up their camp, working quickly under the watchful eyes of the veterans. Some of them couldn't even look at their bikes' wolf patches anymore, suddenly aware of how childish their tough guy act had been. As the gang members loaded their belongings onto their motorcycles, a young Marine from the recruiting office walked over to Harold's porch. "Sir," he said respectfully, "we found something interesting about your friend Razor. He's been claiming to be a veteran, but we checked the records. He never served. That military tattoo he wears? It's as fake as everything else about him." Harold nodded slowly. He'd known all along, real veterans carry themselves differently. They don't need to prove anything to anyone. They know who they are and what they've done. The Steel Wolves' departure was quiet and undignified, a sharp contrast to their usual noisy exits. As they rode away, not one of them revved their engines or looked back. They had learned a hard lesson about real strength and brotherhood, though whether it would stick remained to be seen. The days following the Steel Wolves' departure brought big changes to Cedar Street. The empty lot where the gang had camped was transformed by the veteran riders who stayed behind. They spent a full weekend cleaning up the trash, pulling weeds, and making the space beautiful again. Harold watched from his porch as young Marines from the recruiting office planted new rose bushes in his garden. They had found the exact same variety that Martha had loved, ordering them specially from a nursery 2 states away. The roses weren't just replacements for what was lost. They were a symbol of something new beginning. The veteran motorcycle groups didn't all leave at once. They took turns staying in town, making sure the Steel Wolves didn't get any ideas about coming back. But their presence was different from the gang's. They were respectful, quiet when they needed to be, and quickly became part of the neighborhood's daily life. Every morning, Harold would find different veterans joining him for his walk to Mary's Diner. Some told stories from Vietnam, others from Iraq or Afghanistan. They shared experiences across generations, and Harold found himself telling more stories about his own service than he had in decades. Mary had to add extra tables to accommodate all the veterans who came for breakfast, but she didn't mind. They were the most polite customers she'd ever had. Mrs. Rodriguez's grandchildren were fascinated by the veterans' motorcycles. The riders took time to teach the kids about motorcycle safety and maintenance, always making sure to include lessons about respect and responsibility. The children started calling Harold Grandpa Marine, a nickname that brought a warm smile to his face. One Saturday morning, a month after the confrontation, Harold walked out to find his property had been transformed. The veteran groups had worked through the night to build him a proper flagpole plaza. They had installed benches, planted flowers, and created a small memorial wall with the names of Pine Grove's veterans from all wars. "This isn't just for you, Sergeant," Master Sergeant Cooper explained as Harold admired the work. "It's for every veteran who needs to know they're not alone. Your stand against those bullies showed us something important. Sometimes the oldest warriors need to remind the world what real strength looks like." The plaza became a gathering place for veterans passing through town. They would stop to pay their respects, share stories, and often stay for one of Harold's cups of coffee. His house, once a target for harassment, had become a symbol of veteran brotherhood. Local schools started asking Harold to speak to students about his experiences. At first, he was hesitant. He had never been one to seek attention. But when he saw how the children listened, especially when he talked about honor, courage, and standing up to bullies, he realized these were lessons that needed to be shared. The story of how a 93-year-old Marine had stood up to a biker gang spread far beyond Pine Grove. Veterans organizations across the country used it as an example of their motto, "Never leave a veteran behind." Harold received letters from old warriors and young recruits alike, all thanking him for reminding them what the Brotherhood of Arms truly meant. One evening, as Harold performed his daily flag ceremony, he counted over 20 people standing respectfully nearby. There were veteran riders, neighbors, children, and even a few former Steel Wolves members who had left the gang to turn their lives around. They had learned that real respect isn't taken by force, it's earned through character and service. Harold's garden bloomed better than ever that year. The roses Martha had loved so much were growing strong, tended not just by him now, but by an entire community. Every morning, he would look out at the new flagpole plaza and remember how close he had come to giving up hope. But Marines don't give up. That's what he had learned on the beaches of Okinawa, and what he had proven again on Cedar Street all these years later. Sometimes victory doesn't come from having the biggest muscles or the loudest motorcycles. Sometimes it comes from having the courage to make one phone call and trust in the brotherhood that was forged in battle. As Harold sat on his porch that evening, watching the sun set behind the new memorial wall, he felt at peace. The street was quiet now, but it was the right kind of quiet, the kind that comes from respect rather than fear. He knew that somewhere out there, his old Marine buddies were smiling. Their legacy lived on, not just in medals and memories, but in the unbreakable bonds between warriors of all ages, ready to stand together whenever one of their own needed help.